Question number 2, the Right Honourable Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, does he stand by all of his government statements and actions?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Yes, and particularly the action we're taking to get our economy moving. We know that life is still tough for a lot of Kiwis, but there are encouraging signs that we are making progress. Wages are rising faster than inflation. Goods exports in December were up 17%. Average mortgage rates have fallen now for 2 months in a row. And economists, as you've just heard from the Minister of Finance, are predicting we'll have more interest rate relief very, very shortly. So inflation is low, interest rates are falling, wages are rising, and our farmers and growers are kicking the recovery into gear. There's a long way to go, but we're heading in the right direction.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Why is it acceptable for a minister in his government to ignore repeated warnings that he'd not been given approval to drive a Land Rover up the steps of Parliament and do it anyway, to deny he'd been told not to, and to criticise the security guard who stopped him? Or has he replaced standards of ministerial conduct with Health New Zealand's new mantra of fail early and fail often?
In answer to the first part of the question, the Speaker has dealt to the issue, but we don't need to take 12. We don't need to take 12 to 16 contraventions of the Cabinet manual to get rid of Michael Wood.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Does David Seymour's conduct in driving a Land Rover up the steps of Parliament, despite repeated warnings not to, along with his criticisms of the security guard who stopped him and his insistence he should have been allowed to, meet his expectations in terms of ministerial conduct?
Well, as I've said before, this is an issue for the Speaker, and the Speaker has comprehensively dealt with the issue.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Right Honourable Chris Hipkins.
The issues of ministerial conduct are absolutely questions for the Prime Minister, not for the Speaker. It would be like saying if a minister was charged by the police that would be a question for the police and not for the Prime Minister. Actually, regardless of what decisions you have taken, the Prime Minister is responsible for determining whether a minister's conduct is acceptable or not. He can't deflect the question by saying it's not his responsibility. It is.
Some further elucidation on the question, or the question, ask the question again so you know.
Does David Seymour's conduct in driving a Land Rover up the steps of Parliament, despite repeated warnings not to, along with his criticisms of the security guard who stopped him and his insistence he should have been allowed to, meet his, as Prime Minister, his expectations in terms of ministerial conduct?
As I've said before, that's an issue for the Speaker to talk about the parliamentary steps, but with respect to my ministers, I have every confidence in all of my ministers.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister is responsible for determining the standards of conduct for ministers. I have asked him whether David Seymour's actions meet those standards. The Prime Minister and the Prime Minister alone sets those standards. Nobody else, not you as Speaker, not anybody else. It's not unreasonable to get an indication. I appreciate I can't insist that he says yes or no, but it's not unreasonable to get an indication from him whether David Seymour's recent conduct, particularly on Monday, meets those expectations.
Before I hear any comments on the point of order, I just want to remind members that the Speaker is not responsible for any confidence issues around ministers. The Honourable Chris Bishop.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister answered the question. He said in relation to parliamentary security matters, that is a matter for you, quite rightly, and that he has confidence in all his ministers. The question was addressed and answered.
Mr Speaker, I'd just also make the point that there are several premises in the question which are very close to misleading. I haven't insisted I be allowed to. I've actually accepted your ruling and given you an apology. I've not attacked a security guard. I've simply described the facts.
No further on this. I think the Prime Minister might want to repeat his answer.
As I said, with respect to parliamentary security, that is a decision for the Speaker. I have confidence in all of my ministers.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. I didn't ask him whether he had confidence in his ministers. I asked him whether David Seymour had met his standards when it comes to ministerial conduct. The Prime Minister sets the standards for ministerial conduct. David Seymour, he is obliged to indicate to the House whether or not David Seymour is meeting those.
Well, I think in saying I have confidence in all ministers fairly covers it, but ask the question a different way if you want to. We're not going to try and get away from all this.
Some supplementary. How does driving a Land Rover up the front steps of Parliament meet his expectations around appropriate ministerial conduct?
I have expressed my views publicly on both the issues around the letter and the parliamentary steps. I have met with the Minister and had a positive and constructive conversation about it, and I have every confidence in all of my ministers.
Supplementary question then. Do Todd McClay's statement to another MP, "You're not in Mexico now," Shane Jones's statement, "Send the Mexicans home," and Winston Peters' statement, "Immigrants should, quote, show some gratitude," meet his expectations of ministerial conduct? If so, why?
Well, in answer to the last part of that question, I have huge confidence in the Deputy Prime Minister, who really believes in the Mexico-New Zealand relationship and visited the country and cares deeply about those relationships.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Does Shane Jones's threat to cut funding to organisations that disagree with the government meet his expectations as Prime Minister of Ministerial Conduct, particularly given a backbench MP in the key government was made to apologise for doing the same thing?
I think you've actually heard from, in all of those cases, members expressing in the heat of the moment in this place, they may not have got their language perfect, and they've admitted as much.
Supplementary question, Mr
The
Speaker.
Honourable David Seymour.
To the Prime Minister, does this government have any plans to go through the telephone book and find home buyers with Chinese-sounding names?
No.
The question, Mr Speaker. Does he think his government's decision to adopt tobacco lobby suggestions as government policy, add projects sponsored by donors to the coalition parties to the fast-track list, and appoint a gun lobbyist as Firearms Minister have contributed to New Zealand getting its lowest ever rating in Transparency International's Corruptions Perception Index?
I'm proud of the standing that New Zealand has in the world around transparency and no corruption. We are a high-performing country. I've just actually had meetings this morning talking about exactly that with ASEAN members as well. I'll just say to the member, it's a little bit ironic, as I said yesterday, that we're being lectured by someone who took 16 goes of contravention of the Cabinet Manual to get rid of Michael Wood. Mecca Fighter, he didn't even tell him he was leaving while he was travelling. We've got Stuart Nash with a multiple series of issues before he got sacked as a minister. And you want to talk to me about conduct of my ministers?
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Before you take the point of order, there are a number of people just sitting in that quarter of the House who are constantly speaking, or not actually speaking, barracking during that time. Stop it.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. I suspect the reason for that was that the Prime Minister seems to be more comfortable making commentary on ministers in the previous government than ministers in his own government, noting that all of the ministers he mentioned actually lost their jobs because the previous government actually had some standards which his government doesn't seem to have.
Well, I also note that your question was about inappropriate sort of comments as you saw them, but you had a lot of inappropriate comment coming from some of your side during the answer to that question. Do you have another
supplementary? If he's willing to accept a minister breaking the rules and driving up the steps of Parliament, accept as Foreign Affairs and Trade Ministers making anti-immigrant remarks, accept a senior minister threatening charities, and watch New Zealand's international reputation crumble.
Point of order, the Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr Speaker, there's an old saying, when in Rome do what the Romans do. But the real issue here is no one can surely be condemned for expecting immigrants to come to this country to be grateful for the country they've come to. What's wrong with us when that is a complaint from that side of the House?
Well, that's actually
virtue-seeming nonsense, and he's misleading Parliament.
You've made a point, but it's not a point of order. Please don't interrupt like that. We've got a question on
to the Prime Minister. If he's willing to accept a minister breaking the rules and driving up the steps of Parliament, accept as Foreign Affairs Minister and as Trade Minister making anti-immigrant remarks, accept a senior minister threatening charities, and watch New Zealand's international reputation crumble, and his only solution seems to be to carve the country up and sell it to overseas investors, is he surprised in any way that more than half the country think New Zealand's heading in the wrong direction under his leadership?
Well, just before the Prime Minister answers, I think any reading of standing orders and requirements for questions would find that falls short or certainly very expansive on what might be expected in those questions. Prime Minister may reply.
Yeah, I reject the premise of the conflation of all those issues in that question.